Welcome to Fragile Bonds, to the powerful stories of family, love, loss, and the choices that shape our lives. Now let's begin today's story.
The mornings in New England always begin quietly. Carol Anderson inevitably wakes at 5 in the morning. The habit from her 30 years as a nurse remains ingrained in her body, even 2 years after retirement. In the dim light filtering through the window, she gazes at the photo frame on her bedside table. There, her late husband Tom, their only daughter Jessica, and grandson Ethan smile back at her. It's been 10 years since Tom died of a heart attack. She still remembers that day vividly. Her husband suddenly collapsed in the kitchen while she was making breakfast. She called an ambulance, but he passed away before reaching the hospital. Though Carol had witnessed many deaths as a nurse, losing someone she loved was entirely different. Jessica was the one who supported her through that grief. At the time, Jessica had just started her own graphic design business and was beginning to gain traction, but she came to check on her mother almost daily. Jessica had been a gentle child from an early age. She loved drawing and was always sketching something. Using that talent, she chose her career path and had now become a well-regarded designer in the local community. 5 years ago, Jessica married Derek Miller, a real estate agent. Derek had failed in a previous marriage, but he seemed devoted to Jessica. On their wedding day, the way Derek looked at Jessica was full of love. Carol had felt reassured sending her daughter off. Then 2 years later, Ethan was born. Carol was over the moon at the birth of her first grandchild. Ethan was an unusual child. From birth, she felt he possessed something special. When he stared with those large eyes, she sometimes felt as if he could see right through to the depths of her soul. When Ethan turned 3, he began saying strange things. One day, when he came to visit Carol's house, he was playing with blocks in the living room when he suddenly looked up and said, "Grandma, Grandpa is there." Carol turned around in surprise, but no one was there. Ethan was smiling while staring at a point in the air. "Grandpa is smiling. He says he loves you, Grandma." Those words gave Carol goosebumps. Ethan had been looking toward the chair where Tom used to sit. She told herself it was just a child's imagination, but Ethan's words were sometimes uncannily accurate. Everything changed 2 weeks ago. Jessica suddenly collapsed at home. When Carol rushed to the hospital after Derek's call, Jessica was in intensive care. According to the doctor, it was heart failure. Carol couldn't believe a healthy 35-year-old woman could suddenly suffer heart failure, even with her years of nursing experience. For several days, Carol stayed at the hospital. She held Jessica's hand, desperately calling out to her. But her daughter never opened her eyes again. In her final moment, Jessica's face looked peaceful, yet somehow sad. Derek seemed unable to speak from shock. Seeing him break down crying in the hospital corridor, Carol comforted him. However, somewhere in her heart, she felt something was off. It seemed different from her own grief when she lost her husband. But she convinced herself that everyone grieves differently. The funeral preparations proceeded amid the sorrow. Derek made arrangements between work, and Carol helped. Ethan had been withdrawn and barely spoke. Carol didn't know how her grandson with that mysterious ability was processing his mother's death. The next morning, Carol woke earlier than usual. It was still dark outside, with streetlights streaming through the window. The day had come. The day to say goodbye to her daughter. While putting on her black dress, Carol looked at her reflection in the mirror. She felt like she'd aged 10 years overnight. After 7 o'clock, Carol headed to Derek's house to pick up Ethan. Driving along, she remembered when Jessica was alive. How many times had she visited her daughter's house on this road? Thinking she'd never again see Jessica greeting her at the door with a smile made tears threaten to overflow. When she arrived at Derek's house, the front door opened immediately. Derek was already dressed in a black suit, though his tie was slightly crooked. His hair was neat, but there were faint dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Carol. Ethan is ready. Please take care of him today." Derek's voice was calm. Perhaps too calm. Carol nodded and entered the living room. Ethan was sitting on the sofa in a small black suit. The suit, still too big for his small body, made him look even smaller. "Ethan, Grandma's here to get you." Ethan slowly looked up. His expression was more somber than any 7-year-old's should be. He stood up and walked silently toward Carol. "I'm going now, Dad." Ethan's voice was small and trembling. Derek patted his son's head, but the gesture seemed awkward. Once in the car, Ethan huddled small in the passenger seat. While fastening his seatbelt, Carol looked at her grandson's face. There was something he wanted to say shining in Ethan's eyes, but he wouldn't open his mouth. About 10 minutes after starting to drive, Ethan muttered softly, "Grandma, do you think Mommy was in pain?" Carol felt her chest tighten. Her grip on the steering wheel strengthened. "I think she wasn't in pain. She just fell asleep quickly." She started to say, then swallowed her words. She didn't really know. What Jessica felt at the end, what she was thinking, she could never ask now. "Grandma." Ethan's voice rang out again. Louder this time. "Mommy is here." Carol almost hit the brakes. When they stopped at a traffic light, she looked at Ethan's face. He was staring ahead with a serious expression. "Mommy is always nearby. Dad doesn't seem to see her though." Carol took a deep breath. She knew about Ethan's mysterious ability, but hearing it in this situation was painful. Still, she thought she should listen to her grandson. "Is Mommy saying anything?" Ethan shook his head. But something still lingered in his expression that he wanted to say. The light turned green, and Carol drove on. When they arrived at the funeral home, some attendees were already beginning to gather. Jessica's college friends, work associates, neighbors. Everyone wore sorrowful expressions. Carol took Ethan's hand and headed to the waiting room. Derek was already at the funeral home, greeting attendees. Watching him, Carol again felt that something was off. He certainly looked sad, but something was different. She remembered herself when she lost her husband. Back then, even talking to people had been painful. But Derek was methodically handling the greetings. Everyone grieves differently, Carol told herself. But something still nagged at her heart. When she was alone with Ethan in the waiting room, Ethan suddenly tugged at Carol's sleeve. "Grandma, Mommy says there's something she absolutely has to tell you." Carol knelt down to meet Ethan's eyes. "What does she want to tell me?" Ethan said, trembling. "I don't really understand yet, but it seems like something important. Mommy looks really worried." Just then, a funeral home staff member entered. "It's almost time." Carol stood up and took Ethan's hand. His small hand was cold and trembling. They headed to the funeral venue. Many people had already gathered, with Derek seated in the front row. On the altar was a photo of Jessica smiling. Only 35 years old. So much life should have been ahead of her. Fighting back tears, Carol took her seat with Ethan. The pastor began speaking. About Jessica's character, what she left behind, and the sorrow of sudden parting. Sobs could be heard from among the attendees. Carol too wiped away tears while gazing at her daughter's photo. Then Ethan again gripped Carol's hand tightly. When she turned, Ethan was staring intently toward the altar. No, more precisely, at the empty space beside the altar. "Mommy." Ethan's murmur was too quiet for those around to hear. About 30 minutes into the funeral, the pastor's words echoed through the venue. About Jessica's kindness in life, the joy she brought to those around her, and her peace in heaven. The attendees listened quietly, but only Ethan was restlessly shifting. Carol, concerned about Ethan's state, quietly looked at his face. Ethan's face was pale, with sweat beading on his forehead. His small hands were clenched tightly on his knees, visibly trembling. "Ethan, are you okay?" Carol whispered softly. Ethan shook his head, but his eyes remained fixed on the space beside the altar. As if someone were there, he stared intently. "Do you need to use the bathroom?" When Carol asked again, Ethan shook his head vigorously. "No. Mommy. Mommy is saying something." Hearing those words, a chill ran down Carol's spine. Making sure the other attendees couldn't hear, she lowered her voice further and asked, "What is Mommy saying?" Ethan answered in a trembling voice. "I can't hear clearly, but it seems really important. Mommy is crying." Just then, the pastor called for a moment of silent prayer. As silence enveloped the venue, Ethan became even more restless. Carol had no choice but to take Ethan's hand and quietly stand up. Derek glanced their way, but Carol nodded slightly and led Ethan out of the venue. In the hallway, Ethan took a deep breath. His expression was like someone surfacing from underwater. "Ethan, calm down. Take deep breaths." Carol rubbed her grandson's back while guiding him to a nearby waiting room. Once in the quiet, empty room, Ethan finally spoke. "Grandma, Mommy keeps saying the same thing." "What is she saying?" Carol knelt down to meet Ethan's eyes. Tears were pooling in Ethan's large eyes. "Look at my stomach." Over and over, the same thing. Carol was puzzled. Look at her stomach. What could that mean? Jessica had died of heart failure. Her stomach should have nothing to do with it. "Ethan, isn't Mommy saying anything else?" Ethan closed his eyes, looking like he was concentrating. After a while, he opened his eyes and said, "Baby. I think Mommy is saying baby." Carol's heart leaped. Baby? Could it be? No, it couldn't be. If Jessica had been pregnant, she surely would have told her mother. And Derek would have known too. But Ethan's expression was more serious than ever before. It didn't look like a 7-year-old making up stories. Rather, he seemed to be desperately trying to convey an important message. "Ethan, is Mommy really saying that?" Ethan nodded firmly. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "Mommy looks so sad. She seems to be saying, 'Save my baby.'" Carol stood up. Her nursing experience prompted her to action. If Jessica had truly been pregnant, and if no one knew. "Ethan, wait here for a bit. Grandma is going to check something." Carol left the waiting room and looked for funeral home staff. She approached a young male staff member she met in the hallway. "Excuse me, I need to confirm something." "Yes, how can I help you?" My deceased daughter's body, would it be possible to see it once more?" The staff member looked a bit troubled, but seeing Carol's serious expression, he nodded. "I understand. Please come this way. Carol took Ethan and followed the staff member. They were led to the preparation room behind the funeral venue. There, Jessica lay quietly in a beautiful casket. Jessica's face, with makeup applied, maintained the same beauty as in life. But somewhere in her expression, there seemed to be an indescribable sadness. Carol approached the casket and stared intently at Jessica's body. Her daughter's form wrapped in a black dress. And she looked at the stomach area. At first, she couldn't tell. But looking closely, the stomach area indeed seemed slightly swollen. It was an unnatural bulge, clearly different from normal body shape. This is... Carol gasped. Her nursing experience suggested a possibility. But confirming it would require a doctor's diagnosis. Excuse me, could you call a doctor? There's something I urgently need confirmed. The staff member looked surprised, but seeing Carol's desperate manner, immediately began making a phone call. 10 minutes later, a doctor affiliated with the funeral home arrived. The white-haired elderly doctor listened to Carol's explanation and began carefully examining Jessica's body. After repeated palpation and visual examination, he finally took out a small ultrasound device. After a period of silence, the doctor looked up. His expression was grave. "Ma'am, your daughter appears to have been pregnant." Carol felt her knees nearly give way. Ethan gripped her hand tightly. "Pregnant, how far along?" "Probably 3 to 4 months. Quite advanced." Carol's mind went blank. Jessica had been pregnant. More than 3 months along. Why hadn't she told anyone? Why hadn't Derek known? Or had Derek really not known? The doctor continued. "This is not normal. It's rare for a pregnant woman to suddenly suffer heart failure. We may need to re-examine the cause of death." Carol took out her cell phone with trembling hands. She had to contact the police. Something was wrong. There was still an undiscovered truth hidden in Jessica's death. Ethan quietly gazed at his mother's casket. And in a small voice, he murmured, "Mommy, you finally got to tell them." The police arrived at the funeral home 20 minutes after Carol called. There were 2 detectives, an older male detective and a young female detective. The senior detective, Robert Williams, after hearing the situation from Carol, immediately began talking with the doctor. "It's certainly unnatural that she was 3 to 4 months pregnant and no one knew." Carol nodded at Detective Williams' words. The funeral was temporarily suspended, and the attendees left with confused expressions. Derek would also be questioned by the police. "Pregnant? I had no idea. Jessica never said anything." Derek's face turned pale, clearly shaken. However, Detective Williams stared at Derek with sharp eyes. "You really didn't know? Is it possible for a husband not to notice his wife is more than 3 months pregnant?" Derek looked away and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Recently, work has been busy, we didn't have much time to talk." The young female detective, Sarah Johnson, spoke up. "Mr. Miller, we'll need to check your wife's cell phone and computer. There might be some clues." Derek hesitated for a moment but eventually agreed. The police confiscated Jessica's belongings and began a detailed investigation. That night, Carol was called to the police station. Detective Williams was waiting with a grave expression. "Ms. Montgomery, we found something important on your daughter's cell phone." The detective showed her a tablet. There was an unsent message Jessica had written to her best friend Rachel. "Rachel, I need to talk to you about something. I'm pregnant." But I can't tell Derek. He doesn't want children. And lately, his violence has been getting worse. Carol gasped. Violence? Could Derek have? That's not all. Detective Williams scrolled the screen. A message from another date appeared. Derek hit me again last night. I did everything I could to protect my stomach. I have to protect this baby. But I don't know what to do. I don't want to worry my mother. Tears overflowed from Carol's eyes. Why hadn't Jessica consulted her? Why had she suffered alone? There's more evidence. Detective Johnson showed her photos. They appeared to be selfies Jessica had taken. Blue bruises were visible on her arms and shoulders. Looking at the dates, they were from a week before she died. We also spoke with your daughter's friend, Rachel Harris. Rachel was someone Carol knew well. Jessica's friend since college, she had even been maid of honor at the wedding. According to Ms. Harris's testimony, Jessica had hidden bruises several times. When asked why, she said she'd just fallen, but Ms. Harris was suspicious. Carol held her head in her hands. Everything had been happening right in front of her, yet she'd noticed nothing. She felt like a failure as a mother. The next day, the police also spoke with Ethan. Under the supervision of a child psychology specialist, questions were asked gently. Ethan, have you ever seen your dad and mom fighting? Ethan was silent at first, but eventually nodded slightly. Dad hit mommy. Since when? I don't know, but I saw it many times. Mommy was always crying. Ethan's testimony matched the other evidence. Furthermore, neighbors testified that they'd heard yelling and noises from the Miller house late at night. 3 days later, Derek was called to the police station again. Confronted with the evidence so far, he finally gave in. Yes. I did hit her. But I never meant to kill her. Derek's voice was shaking. Detective Williams asked sternly. Did you really not know about the pregnancy? After a long silence, Derek shook his head. I knew. 2 months ago, Jessica told me. And I didn't want a child. Work wasn't going well, we had no money. So I told her to abort it. Carol clenched her fists. Anger and sadness welled up simultaneously. Jessica refused. So I lost my temper. You became violent. Derek nodded. Continuing through tears. At first I just pushed her lightly. But it gradually escalated. When stress built up, I'd reflexively hit her. Work stress, financial pressure, I took everything out on Jessica. A doctor was called in to provide medical opinion. When a pregnant woman experiences continuous violence and stress, it can strain the heart and potentially cause heart failure. Especially when psychological stress and physical violence combine, it places considerable burden on the mother's body. Derek was ultimately arrested on charges of domestic violence and involuntary manslaughter. As he was handcuffed, he muttered, I'm sorry, Jessica. But those words didn't reach anyone's heart. It was too late. After leaving the police station, Carol hugged Ethan. If this small child hadn't conveyed his mother's final message, the truth would have been buried forever in darkness. Ethan, thank you. Because of you, we learned Mommy's truth. Ethan buried his face in his grandmother's chest and cried. Is Mommy not suffering anymore? She's definitely not suffering anymore. She's resting peacefully in heaven with the baby. In the subsequent trial, Derek was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He broke down crying in court, but no one sympathized anymore. 1 year later in autumn, Carol and Ethan stood in the cemetery. Fresh flowers were placed at Jessica's gravestone, and soft autumn sunlight enveloped them both. Ethan had turned 8, grown a bit taller, and his face had matured. After the trial ended and Derek was incarcerated, Ethan came to live with Carol. The first few months he'd wake from nightmares in the middle of the night, but with Carol's love and professional counseling, he gradually healed his emotional wounds. "Grandma, I drew a picture at school today." Ethan took drawing paper from his backpack. It showed 3 people smiling under a blue sky. Carol, Ethan, and Jessica. "I drew Mommy too. Because Mommy is always with us." Carol smiled gently. Ethan's mysterious ability remained, but recently he seemed to feel his deceased mother not as something frightening, but as a warm presence. "What a lovely picture. Mommy must be happy too." Ethan spoke to the gravestone. "Mommy, how are you? Are you having fun with the baby?" The wind rustled, and the tree leaves made a soft sound. Ethan listened to that sound and nodded with satisfaction. "Mommy says thank you. Thank you to Grandma and Ethan." Tears welled in Carol's eyes. Over this past year, she'd remembered Jessica many times and regretted not noticing sooner. But thanks to Ethan, the truth had come to light, and Jessica and her unborn baby had received justice. She'd heard Derek was spending lonely days in prison. No one visited him. His parents had abandoned him, and his friends had left. Though he'd brought it on himself, Carol felt the terror of how far a person could fall. "Ethan, let's keep living together from now on." Carol gently took Ethan's hand. Ethan nodded with a smile. "Yes. I'm not lonely with Grandma." The two held hands and slowly left the cemetery. On the way home, Ethan said, "Grandma, Mommy said one last thing. Love Ethan for me too." Carol stopped and hugged Ethan. "Of course. You're my treasure. I'll love you lots, for Mommy's share and Daddy's share too." The setting sun stretched their shadows long. Though it was a new family form born from tragedy, there was definite love and bonds there. The truth Jessica had tried to protect with her life had been revealed through Ethan's special power, and it had led to new hope.